There are silences that build walls, and there are silences that dismantle them, brick by painstaking brick. For the longest time, the quiet that lived between my roommate Liam and me was a comfortable, structural thing. It was the foundation of our friendship, a shared space where we could simply exist without the need for noise. But then came a new kind of silence, one that was not empty but filled with an unbearable weight, a humming tension that felt like the air before a storm. It was in that new, charged atmosphere that he turned to me one Tuesday night, the blue light of the television flickering across his face, and gave voice to a request that would change the entire architecture of my world. He said he hated the quiet, and then he asked if I would sit with him for a while. It was a simple request, uttered so softly it was almost swallowed by the canned laughter from the sitcom we were pretending to watch. But to me, it was a seismic event. It was the first tremor in a fault line I had long known existed but had meticulously avoided acknowledging, a deep fracture in the bedrock of my own carefully constructed emotional life. For 3 years, I had navigated the geography of our shared apartment with the precision of a cartographer, mapping out the safe zones, the neutral territories, and the vast, uncharted wilderness of what I felt for him. My feelings were a hidden continent on my own internal map, a place I never intended for him to discover. And in that moment, with that simple, vulnerable question, it felt as though he had unknowingly chartered a course straight for its shores, his ship's lantern cutting through the fog I had so carefully cultivated. I had become an expert in the art of proximity without contact, of conversation without confession. And now, he was asking to close the distance I had worked so hard to maintain. To understand the magnitude of those 9 words, you have to understand Liam. And to understand Liam, you have to understand the space he occupied, both in our apartment and in the world. He was a creature of kinetic energy, a man whose stillness was always temporary, a brief pause between movements. A swimmer, his body was a study in efficient power, broad shoulders, and a lean frame built for cleaving through water. He moved through our apartment like a contained weather system, leaving a trail of damp towels, misplaced coffee mugs, and the faint, clean scent of chlorine in his wake. His energy was not chaotic, but purposeful. Even when he was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, there was a thrum of potential in him, the sense that he was merely charging up for his next burst of activity. He was a software consultant, a job that demanded a different kind of energy, a focused, cerebral intensity that left him drained and frayed at the edges by the end of the day. It was this version of Liam, the one with the tension still coiled in his shoulders and the ghost of a computer screen reflected in his eyes, who had started to seek the quiet of our shared living room. We had met in our second year of university, thrown together by the indifferent algorithm of student housing. I was quiet, an art student who spent most of his time behind a camera lens, learning to see the world in frames and compositions, in light and shadow. He was on the swim team, a campus celebrity in a small way, part of a loud, boisterous circle of friends who communicated in inside jokes and backslapping camaraderie. We were an unlikely pairing, a study in contrasts. Our first few months were a polite dance of avoidance. I would retreat to my room when his friends came over. He would be gone for morning practice before I was even awake. The apartment was less a home and more a shared storage facility for 2 separate lives that happened to occupy the same address. I was certain that at the end of the year, we would go our separate ways, 2 ships that had passed in the cramped, poorly lit hallway of a university dorm. The change came unexpectedly during the bleak, lifeless stretch of midwinter exams. I was wrestling with a photography project, printing dozens of black and white images in the makeshift darkroom I'd set up in my bathroom, the acrid smell of fixer clinging to my clothes. I emerged late one night, bleary-eyed and defeated, to find Liam at the kitchen table, surrounded by a mountain of textbooks on coding languages I couldn't begin to comprehend. His face was pale with exhaustion, his usually vibrant eyes shadowed and dull. He looked up as I padded into the kitchen for a glass of water, and for the first time, the easy, confident mask was gone. He just looked tired, utterly and completely tired. He asked me about my project, and I, in turn, asked him about his exams. We talked for over an hour, 2 exhausted soldiers in the foxhole of academia, and in that shared moment of vulnerability, something shifted. The wall between our 2 worlds developed a door. After that night, The door stayed open. We started leaving our bedroom doors ajar, a silent invitation. We discovered a shared affinity for terrible science fiction movies, for late-night bowls of cereal eaten in comfortable silence. I learned that his boisterous energy was a shield, a performance he put on for the world. In the quiet of our apartment, he was softer, more thoughtful. He had a dry, observational humor that surfaced unexpectedly. He was fascinated by my photography, asking insightful questions about composition and light, seeing things in my prints that I hadn't noticed myself. He would watch, quietly, as I sketched in my notebook, never interrupting, just observing the process with a kind of gentle curiosity. And I, in turn, learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, to know when the pressure of his coursework or the demands of his team were wearing him down. I learned that he wasn't just a force of nature. He was a landscape, with his own seasons of sun and storm. And somewhere in the midst of all that, somewhere in the quiet evenings and shared laughter, I fell in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, crashing wave, but a slow, inexorable tide rising within me. It was a quiet, aching thing, a love that took root in the spaces between our conversations, in the way he'd smile when I made him coffee in the morning, in the unconscious trust he showed when he'd fall asleep on the couch while I was working nearby. I packed the feeling away, stored it in a locked room in the deepest part of my heart. He was my friend, my best friend. He was, as far as I knew, completely and unshakably straight. To confess my feelings would be an act of emotional vandalism, dynamiting the comfortable, essential structure of our friendship for something that could never be. So I became a custodian of my own secret, polishing it in the dark, guarding it fiercely, and living with the constant, low-grade hum of unspoken love. It was a lonely occupation, but the friendship it preserved was worth the solitude. After graduation, the decision to get an apartment together felt natural, inevitable. Our lives had become so intertwined that the thought of untangling them was jarring. We found a small, two-bedroom place with good light and thin walls, and we settled into a new rhythm, one dictated by work schedules instead of class timetables. His life remained a whirlwind of activity: work, the gym, a rotating cast of friends, and a serious girlfriend named Sarah. She was nice enough, bright and bubbly, and she fit perfectly into the version of Liam the world saw. When she was around, he became that person again, louder, more performative. I would feel a familiar pang of something I refused to name, and I would retreat to my room, giving them the space they deserved, becoming once again the quiet observer on the periphery. I convinced myself I was happy for him, and in a way I was. Seeing him happy was a complicated, bittersweet kind of joy. It was like watching a beautiful sunset through a pane of glass. I could appreciate the beauty, but I could never feel its warmth. The shift, when it came, was not a slow erosion but a sudden, violent fracture. It began, as so many things did, with a phone call. I was in the living room, editing photos, the soft click of my mouse the only sound in the apartment. Liam had been out with Sarah. When he came home, the usual energy that heralded his arrival was absent. He didn't drop his keys in the ceramic bowl by the door with their customary clatter. He didn't call out a greeting. He simply walked in, closed the door with a quiet, definitive click, and stood in the hallway. I looked up, my fingers freezing over the keyboard. His face was a pale, blank mask, but his eyes were shattered. He didn't say a word. He just walked to his room and shut the door. It was the first time since we had moved in together that he had closed it completely. The silence that followed was different. It was heavy, suffocating. It was a silence born not of comfort, but of pain. I didn't see him for the rest of that night. The next day, he emerged looking hollowed out. He made coffee, moved through his morning routine with a robotic precision, but he was a ghost in his own life. He finally spoke as he was about to leave for work, his voice a raw, scraped thing. Sarah and I broke up, and that was it. No details, no explanation. Just a stark, brutal fact left hanging in the air between us. In the weeks that followed, I watched him navigate his grief. He threw himself into work, into the pool, into anything that would exhaust his body and numb his mind. He was running from the stillness, from the quiet moments where thoughts could catch up to him. His friends would come over, and he would put on the mask, laughing at their jokes, but his eyes were always distant, his smile never quite reaching them. I saw the effort it took, the immense energy he expended just to appear normal. And then, when they were gone, he would deflate, the life draining out of him, leaving behind a profound weariness that settled deep in his bones. He would sit on the couch, flipping through channels, not really watching anything, just creating noise to fill the emptiness of the apartment, the emptiness inside himself. He started drinking more, not in a dangerous way, but in a steady, methodical way, a couple of beers every night to blur the edges of his thoughts. He stopped eating properly, subsisting on takeout and protein bars. I tried to bridge the gap, making extra portions of dinner and leaving a plate for him, making sure the coffee pot was full in the morning. He would thank me with a distracted nod, a brief flash of gratitude in his eyes before the curtain of his sorrow fell again. I was his roommate, his friend, and I felt utterly useless. I was a lighthouse keeper watching a ship founder on the rocks, my light able to illuminate the disaster, but powerless to prevent it. All I could do was bear witness to his pain, to hold space for it, and to wait. The nights were the worst. The city would grow quiet, the distractions of the day would fade, and he would be left alone with the silence he was so desperately trying to outrun. I would hear him pacing in his room, the floorboards creaking a mournful rhythm. Sometimes I would find him in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, staring into the open refrigerator as if the answer to some unasked question was hidden behind the milk carton. We would exchange a few tired words, and then he would retreat back to his room, back to his restless solitude. The open-door policy we had cultivated for years was gone. His door was always closed now, a physical manifestation of the emotional barrier he had erected. I missed my friend. I missed the easy comfort, the shared silence that had once been a sanctuary. Now, silence was the enemy, the thing he was fighting with every fiber of his being. Which brought us to that Tuesday night. It had been nearly 2 months since the breakup. The initial, acute phase of his grief had subsided into a chronic, low-grade melancholy. He had started to talk again, in small bursts, about work, about a new training regimen at the pool. He was re-engaging with life, but tentatively, like someone testing the ice on a frozen lake. That evening, we were on the couch, a familiar configuration from our university days, but the space between us felt different. It was no longer a comfortable, neutral zone. It felt charged, heavy with everything that had gone unsaid for weeks. The sitcom on the television was a meaningless stream of noise, a flimsy curtain drawn over the profound quiet of the room. I was acutely aware of him, of the way he was slumped into the cushions, of the rhythmic tap of his finger against his thigh. The air was thick with it, his loneliness, my helplessness, the ghost of a friendship we were both trying to figure out how to rebuild. That was when he turned off the television. The sudden absence of sound was startling, a vacuum that pulled all the air from the room. The only light came from a single lamp in the corner, casting long, soft shadows. He stared at the blank screen for a long moment, his profile etched in the dim light. I could see the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hand. I held my breath, waiting. "I hate this," he whispered, his voice rough. "The quiet. It's so loud." I understood completely. It was the paradox of grief, how the absence of sound could become a deafening roar of memories and regrets. I searched for something to say, some comforting platitude, but my throat was tight. Words felt inadequate, clumsy. He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were dark pools of exhaustion and something else, something I couldn't name. It was a raw, unguarded vulnerability that I had only seen glimpses of before. It felt like I was looking at the real Liam, the one who existed beneath the layers of confidence and charm. "Julian," he said, my name a soft weight in the air. Would you just sit with me for a while? I just don't want to be alone right now." My heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest. It was the need in his voice, the quiet desperation that undid me. This wasn't my roommate asking to hang out. This was a drowning man asking for a lifeline. All my carefully constructed walls, all my rules about distance and self-preservation, they crumbled into dust. There was no choice to make. There was only him. "Of course," I said, my own voice barely a whisper. "I'm not going anywhere." A visible wave of relief washed over him, softening the hard lines of his face. He nodded, a small, grateful gesture, and turned back to the blank television screen. We sat there in the dim light, in the loud silence, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a truce. The space between us was still there, a physical distance on the worn fabric of the couch, but the emotional chasm had begun to close. He had built a wall around himself, and with that one question, he had just shown me where he'd hidden the key. He didn't want to be alone in his quiet, and so I entered it with him, prepared to sit in the darkness for as long as he needed. That night established a new ritual, an unspoken agreement forged in the crucible of his grief. It did not happen every night, but often enough to become a pattern. He would come home from work, frayed and weary, and after a while, he would gravitate towards the living room, settling onto the couch. I would be there, reading or sketching, and a quiet understanding would pass between us. He didn't have to ask again. My presence became the answer to the question he had already asked. We would exist in that shared space, sometimes with the low murmur of a documentary playing in the background, sometimes in complete silence, the only sounds the rustle of a page turning or the soft scratch of my pencil on paper. He was rebuilding himself, and he had chosen me to be the quiet witness to his reconstruction. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the physical distance between us on the couch began to shrink. It started with him leaning his head back against the cushions, his eyes closed, a silent admission of exhaustion. Then one evening, after a particularly grueling day at his firm, he slumped onto the couch and let his head fall sideways, resting it on the cushion a mere inch from my shoulder. I froze, every nerve ending in my body suddenly on high alert. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the faint, familiar scent of his shampoo. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I forced myself to remain still, to breathe evenly, to project an aura of calm I was nowhere near feeling. To him, this was likely a simple, unconscious act of seeking comfort. To me, it was everything. It was a test of my control, a trial by fire for my carefully guarded heart. The next time it happened, a few nights later, his head didn't just rest near my shoulder. It rested on it. The weight of it was both a comfort and an agony. It was solid, real, a grounding pressure that sent a jolt of electricity through my entire system. His hair was soft against my cheek, and I could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. I sat there, rigid as a statue, my book forgotten in my lap. My entire universe had contracted to that single point of contact. I was terrified that he would feel the frantic beating of my heart, that he would sense the tidal wave of emotion crashing against the shores of my composure. But he just sighed, a deep, shuddering exhalation, and seemed to sink even more heavily against me. In his exhaustion and sorrow, he had found a harbor in me, completely unaware that for the captain of that harbor, his ship's proximity was setting off every warning bell and siren. This became the new normal. The ritual evolved. He would come home, shed the armor of his day, and find his way to the couch, to my side. He would settle in, and after a few minutes of quiet, he would lean against me. Sometimes he would talk, his voice a low rumble against my shoulder, telling me about a frustrating client or a breakthrough in a line of code. Other times, he would just be silent, letting the quiet do its work, but a shared quiet now, not a solitary one. And eventually, almost always, his breathing would deepen, and he would fall asleep, his body completely relaxed and trusting against mine. Those were the hardest moments. I would sit there for hours sometimes, my arm going numb, afraid to move and wake him, just watching the way the lamplight played on his face, tracing the lines of his eyelashes, the curve of his lips. It was a sweet, exquisite torture. I was closer to him than I had ever been, and yet the distance felt more immense than ever. He was seeking comfort, and I was a source of it, an anonymous, warm presence. I felt like a charging station, a utility. He needed something, and I was providing it. The love I felt for him made it impossible to refuse, but it also made every moment a painful reminder of what I couldn't have. I began to live for those evenings, for that fraught, precious intimacy. My own life began to feel like a prelude to those hours on the couch. My work, my friends, my own quiet moments, they were all just the time I had to get through before he came home. I was becoming an expert in the subtle language of his body. I could tell by the set of his shoulders how his day had been. I could distinguish between the sleep of simple exhaustion and the deeper, heavier sleep of emotional escape. I learned the exact spot on my shoulder where his head fit most comfortably. I learned that he sometimes mumbled in his sleep, fragmented words about code and swimming strokes. I was a scholar of Liam, studying a text that I was allowed to hold but never truly read, never truly understand. One night, the ritual shifted again. It was late, and a cold autumn rain was lashing against the windows. He had been particularly quiet all evening, the weight of his mood a palpable presence in the room. He was leaning against me, asleep, and I was listening to the rhythm of the rain, my own thoughts a somber counterpoint. Suddenly, he shifted in his sleep, not waking, but moving with the deep, unconscious instinct for greater comfort. He turned towards me, his arm coming around my waist, his hand resting on my hip. His face was now buried in the crook of my neck, his breath warm against my skin. My entire body went rigid. This was new territory. This was not the passive weight of a head on a shoulder. This was an embrace. A sleeping, unconscious embrace, but an embrace nonetheless. My mind raced, trying to categorize the action, to strip it of its emotional significance. He's asleep, I told myself. It means nothing. It's just a reflex. But my body wasn't listening to the frantic rationalizations of my brain. My body was responding to the solid warmth of his, to the steadying weight of his arm, to the feeling of his breath on my skin. A profound, aching tenderness washed over me, so potent it almost brought tears to my eyes. This was the fantasy I had ruthlessly suppressed for years, playing out in reality under the guise of plausible deniability. He was holding me, and all I could do was sit there, breathing in the scent of rain and soap and the unique, indescribable scent that was just him, and pretend that it wasn't simultaneously the most wonderful and the most painful thing I had ever experienced. I felt like a photograph, slowly developing in a chemical bath of my own longing, the image of my love for him becoming sharper, clearer, and more painfully detailed with every passing second. From then on, the sleeping embrace became a part of the ritual. It was a line that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. He was seeking not just proximity, but connection. He was, in his sleep, reaching for an anchor in the storm of his own mind, and his subconscious had chosen me. I tried to find a way to be okay with it, to reframe it in my mind as an act of profound friendship, a testament to the trust between us. And it was that. But it was also a constant, grinding reminder of the chasm between the reality of our situation and the desires of my own heart. I was living in a state of suspended animation, caught between the joy of his closeness and the terror of what it meant, or what it didn't mean. I was the keeper of a fragile, beautiful secret, and the weight of it was becoming almost too much to bear. Each night was a gamble. Each time he reached for me in his sleep, I felt a thrill of hope, followed immediately by a wave of guilt and fear. Hope that it meant something more. Fear that he would one day wake up in the middle of the act and be horrified, repulsed. The fear that I would be exposed, that my love would be seen not as a sanctuary, but as a betrayal. The tension was building within me, a pressure seeking release. I found myself becoming more withdrawn during the day, saving all my emotional energy for the evenings. My photography suffered. When I looked through the lens, all I saw were compositions of closeness and distance, of light and shadow, metaphors for the man sleeping on my shoulder. He, on the other hand, seemed to be getting better. The deep, hollowed-out look in his eyes was starting to fade, replaced by glimmers of the old Liam. He was laughing more, engaging in conversations, making plans with friends again. Our evenings on the couch seemed to be healing him, recharging him in a way that nothing else could. I should have been happy for him, and I was. But a selfish, secret part of me was terrified. What would happen when he was fully healed? When he no longer needed the quiet comfort I provided? Would the ritual end? Would he pull away, leaving me with nothing but the ghost of his warmth and a heart full of impossible feelings? The architecture of our friendship had been rebuilt on this new, fragile foundation of nocturnal intimacy, and I was terrified that once he was strong enough to stand on his own, he would walk away, and the whole structure would come crashing down around me. The breaking point arrived on a Friday night in late November. He had gone out with his swim team friends for the first time in months. I had stayed home, telling myself I was relieved to have a night to myself, a night free from the emotional tightrope act. But the apartment felt cavernous without him, the silence oppressive. The quiet I had once cherished now felt like an accusation. I tried to work, but I couldn't focus. I just sat on the couch, in my usual spot, the cushion still holding the faint impression of his weight, and I felt a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache in my chest. I had become addicted to the poison that was also my cure. He came home late, well after midnight. I heard his key in the lock, the soft click of the door. He was drunk, not sloppy, but softened, his movements loose and uncoordinated. He stumbled into the living room, a sheepish grin on his face. The smell of beer and cold night air clung to him. "Hey," he slurred slightly, his smile wide and a little sad. "You're up? Couldn't sleep," I said, my voice quiet. He stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, looking at me. The bravado he'd likely worn all night was gone, stripped away by alcohol and exhaustion. He just looked young and lost. He didn't say anything. He just came over to the couch and folded his large frame into the space next to me. The ritual began, but this time it felt different. He was awake. His movements were deliberate. He leaned his head on my shoulder, his eyes open and staring at the opposite wall. He was radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the alcohol. It was a feverish, restless energy. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The air was electric, thick with unspoken words. Then, he lifted his head. He turned to face me, his body angled towards mine. The space between us was now charged with a new kind of tension, something that was not about comfort or grief, but something sharper, more urgent. His eyes, even in the dim light, were incredibly clear, focused on my face with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. He was searching for something in my expression, and I was terrified of what he might find. "Julian," he said, his voice low and steady now, the slur completely gone. It was the sound of a man standing on a precipice. My heart was a drum against my ribs, beating out a frantic, panicked rhythm. This was it. This was the moment the fragile world we had built was either going to solidify into something real or shatter into a million pieces. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and gently touched my cheek. His touch was hesitant, questioning. It was not the familiar, unconscious touch of sleep. This was intentional. This was a choice. A current of heat shot from his fingertips through my entire body. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed by a mixture of terror and a wild, soaring hope that was so powerful it threatened to consume me. His eyes scanned my face, my eyes, my mouth, and then back to my eyes. He seemed to be asking a question without words, a question so enormous it couldn't be spoken aloud. And in my stillness, in my wide, unguarded eyes, he must have found the answer he was looking for. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. It was not a question about a kiss. It was a question about everything. About friendship, about boundaries, about the unspoken language we had been speaking for months. It was a plea for permission to cross a line from which there was no return. It was the most vulnerable thing I had ever heard. I couldn't find my voice, so I just nodded. A slow, single nod. And then he closed the small distance between us. His lips were soft, tentative, tasting of beer in a desperation that mirrored my own. It was not a passionate kiss, not a kiss of cinematic grandeur. It was quiet, searching, and deeply, deeply sad. It was a confession. It was an apology. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the sound of a wall finally coming down, not with a crash, but with a quiet, mournful sigh of surrender. He kissed me as if he were starving, and I was the first real thing he had tasted in months. And I kissed him back with all the years of unspoken longing, with all the nights of silent vigil, with a tenderness that I was afraid would break us both. In the quiet of our living room, surrounded by the ghosts of our friendship, we crossed the line, and the world on the other side was a terrifying, beautiful, unknown country. The kiss ended as gently as it began. He pulled back slowly, his hand still on my cheek, his thumb stroking my skin. His eyes were wide, filled with a dawning wonder and a profound, bottomless fear. The silence that descended was heavier than any that had come before. It was the silence of consequence, the deafening quiet after the explosion. We had detonated something, and now we were left standing in the rubble, trying to understand what, if anything, was left standing. He was the first to look away. He dropped his hand from my face as if he'd been burned, and the loss of contact was a physical blow. He scrambled back, putting a few inches of distance between us on the couch, a chasm that felt miles wide. He ran a hand through his hair, his breathing suddenly ragged. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at his own hands, which were clenched into tight fists in his lap. I'm sorry, he stammered, the words mangled by confusion. I shouldn't have. I'm drunk. I didn't mean. Each word was a separate shard of glass in my heart. Drunk. Didn't mean to. The classic, cowardly retreat. The plausible deniability he was desperately trying to construct around an act that had felt anything but meaningless. A cold, sick feeling washed over me, a bitter tide of humiliation and pain. I had misinterpreted everything. I had been a fool, a convenience, a warm body to cling to in the dark. The intimacy I had cherished, the vulnerability I had protected, it was all just a byproduct of his grief and loneliness, and now, with a single, drunken impulse, he had shattered it. Liam, don't, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I was fighting to keep it steady, to not let the tremor of my own devastation show. No, this is messed up, he said, shaking his head, still refusing to meet my eyes. He stood up abruptly, pacing the small space in front of the couch like a caged animal. I'm not. You're my best friend, Julian. What the hell did I just do? He was talking to himself, not to me. He was trying to reconcile his action with his identity, with the version of himself he thought he knew. The straight guy. The jock. Sarah's boyfriend. My roommate. The kiss didn't fit into any of those boxes, and the cognitive dissonance was making him panic. He was spiraling, and in his panic, he was trampling all over the fragile, beautiful thing that had just happened between us. Without another word, he turned and fled to his room, shutting the door behind him with a soft, final click. The sound echoed in the silent apartment, a gunshot, a gavel, a final verdict. I was left alone on the couch, the phantom feeling of his lips still on mine, the air still thick with the charge of what had passed between us. But the warmth was gone, replaced by an encroaching, Arctic cold. He had crossed the line, and then, in a panic, he had tried to erase it, to pretend it was never there. But I was there. I had felt it, and I knew that some lines, once crossed, leave a permanent mark on the map of your life. He had taken refuge in my quiet, and then he had shattered it, leaving me with a new silence, one filled with the ringing of rejection and the shrapnel of my own broken hope. The next few days were a masterclass in avoidance. The apartment, once our shared sanctuary, became a carefully partitioned territory. We were two ghosts haunting the same house, moving through the rooms at different times, leaving traces of our presence. A coffee mug in the sink, a wet towel on the bathroom floor, but never occupying the same space at the same time. The open doors were gone. Both our bedroom doors remained firmly shut, new walls where there had once been invitations. The silence was no longer a space for comfort or grief. It was a weapon, a thick, suffocating blanket of unspoken accusations and regret. Liam was a phantom. He left for the pool before I woke up and came home long after I had retreated to my room. I would hear his key in the lock, hear his quiet footsteps in the hall, the soft click of his door closing, and each sound was a fresh twist of the knife. He was avoiding me with a desperate, frantic energy, and his avoidance was louder than any argument we could have had. It screamed his regret, his confusion, his fear. And it confirmed my own worst fears, that I was a mistake, an aberration, a regrettable consequence of a drunken, lonely night. The pain was a physical thing. It was a constant pressure behind my ribs, a tightness in my throat. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I would lie in my bed and stare at the ceiling, replaying the kiss over and over in my mind, trying to pinpoint the exact moment it had all gone wrong. But it hadn't felt wrong. It had felt like coming home. It had felt inevitable. The wrongness came after, in his panicked retreat, in his suffocating silence. I felt a cold, hard anger beginning to form beneath the layers of my hurt. Anger at him for his cowardice, for his refusal to even talk to me. But mostly, anger at myself, for allowing myself to hope, for believing, for even a moment, that the quiet language we had been speaking had the same meaning for both of us. I tried to lose myself in my work, but it was useless. I would sit at my desk, staring at a photograph on my screen, and see only his face. I would see the fear in his eyes after he kissed me, the confusion that had curdled something beautiful into something he saw as shameful. He had taken my feelings for him, feelings I had nurtured in secret for years, and he had made them sordid. He had held a mirror up to my love, and in his reflection, it had become ugly. The thought was unbearable. I couldn't live like this, in this cold war of silence, in this house full of ghosts. Something had to break. After 3 days of this agonizing limbo, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't let him erase what had happened. I couldn't let him reduce it to a drunken mistake. It was more than that, for both of us, and his fear didn't give him the right to deny its reality. That evening, I didn't retreat to my room. I waited. I sat on the couch, in the exact spot where he had kissed me, and I waited for him to come home. The apartment was dark, save for the single lamp in the corner, a spotlight on an empty stage. I heard his key in the lock just after 10. The door opened, and he stepped inside, his shoulders slumped with the weariness of the day. He stopped dead when he saw me sitting there. His body tensed, a cornered animal preparing for flight. I could see the panic flash in his eyes, the immediate instinct to turn and run back to the safety of his room. "Don't," I said, my voice calm and even, though my heart was hammering. "Don't you dare walk away, Liam. We need to talk." He hesitated in the doorway, his hand still on the knob. For a long moment, I thought he was going to ignore me, that he would just retreat and leave me talking to an empty hallway. But then, with a sigh of resignation that seemed to drain the last of his energy, he let go of the door, closed it softly, and walked into the living room. He didn't sit down. He stood by the armchair, keeping a safe distance, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall somewhere over my head. "Nothing to talk about," I echoed, a humorless laugh escaping my lips. "You kiss me, you tell me you're drunk and you didn't mean it, and then you spend 3 days avoiding me like I have the plague, and you think there's nothing to talk about?" He flinched at the word kiss, as if it were a physical blow. "I told you I was drunk. It was a mistake. I'm sorry. Can we just forget it happened and go back to how things were?" Go back. The anger I had been suppressing finally broke through, hot and sharp. I stood up to face him, my own body thrumming with adrenaline. "Go back to what, Liam? To me sitting here while you sleep on my shoulder? To you holding me in your sleep every other night? Was that a mistake, too? Was that just you being drunk on exhaustion? Or does that not count because you were unconscious and can pretend it never happened?" His face went pale. He finally looked at me, his eyes wide with shock. He had no idea I knew. He had no idea of the intimacy he had initiated in his sleep, of the lines he had already blurred long before that kiss. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. "For weeks," I said, my voice shaking with the force of my confession. "You have used me as your own personal teddy bear. You have fallen asleep on me, held me, sought comfort from me in the most intimate ways. And I let you. I sat here, night after night, while my arm went numb, because you were hurting and I'm your friend. I let you because I care about you. And I never said a word. But that kiss, that was not a mistake. That was the logical conclusion of everything that has been happening in this room for the past 2 months. And you are not going to stand there and tell me it was meaningless." He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He looked utterly lost, as if I had just described a version of reality he had never witnessed. He was seeing the narrative of the past few months through my eyes for the first time, and it was clear the perspective shift was a violent one. I didn't know," he stammered, running a hand over his face. "I swear, Julian, I didn't realize I was doing that, but you felt it." I pressed, taking a step closer. "You felt something. That night, you weren't just drunk. You were something else. You looked at me, and you saw me, and you kissed me. Don't you dare try to tell me that was just the beer talking. I deserve more respect than that. What we have deserves more respect than that." He finally broke. A choked sob escaped his throat, and he sank into the armchair, burying his face in his hands. His broad shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. The sight of him, so broken and overwhelmed, extinguished my anger in an instant, leaving only a deep, profound ache in its place. I went to him, kneeling on the floor in front of his chair, my earlier anger forgotten. "Liam, talk to me," I pleaded, my voice soft now. "Please, just tell me what's going on in your head." It took him a long time to speak. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a desperate, terrified confusion. "I don't know what's happening to me," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Ever since Sarah, everything's been broken. The world went quiet, and I couldn't stand it. And you were the only thing that felt solid. Sitting here with you was the only time my brain would shut up. It was the only time I felt safe." He took a shuddering breath. "And then it started to change. I started needing it, needing to be near you. And I didn't understand why. It scared me. That night, when I came home, I'd spent the whole evening pretending to be the old me, laughing and drinking with the guys, and it was all just hollow. All I could think about was coming home, coming back here. To you." He looked at me then, his gaze direct and filled with a raw, painful honesty. "When I saw you sitting here, I wasn't drunk anymore. I was just done pretending. And I looked at you, and all I could think was that I wanted to kiss you more than I had ever wanted to kiss anyone in my entire life. And it terrified me, because I'm not supposed to feel that. For you. For a guy? What does that make me? What is wrong with me?" His confession hung in the air between us, a fragile, trembling thing. It was everything I had secretly hoped for and everything I had dreaded. His feelings were real, but they were tangled up in so much fear and confusion, so much shame born of a lifetime of expectations. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting himself. "There is nothing wrong with you," I said, my voice fierce with conviction. I reached out and took his hand, my fingers lacing through his. His hand was cold and clammy, but he didn't pull away. He clung to my hand like a drowning man. "There is nothing wrong with feeling what you feel. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to be confused. But it's not okay to run. And it's not okay to push me away because you're afraid of what it means." He looked down at our joined hands, a look of wonder on his face, as if he were seeing them for the first time. He slowly, hesitantly, squeezed my fingers. "I'm so scared, Julian," he whispered. "I know," I said softly. "Me too." And in that moment, in that shared admission of fear, the last of the walls between us finally dissolved. The conflict was not over, but the war was. We were no longer on opposite sides of a silent battlefield. We were two scared people, sitting in the rubble of everything we thought we knew, holding hands in the dark. And for the first time in days, the quiet in the room was not an enemy. It was a space to heal. It was a place to begin. The conversation that night was the beginning of a slow, careful reconstruction. We didn't solve everything. We didn't suddenly have a label for what we were or a clear path forward. What we had was honesty. Liam talked, and I listened. He unspooled years of unspoken assumptions, of the life he had always expected to live, and how his feelings for me were a seismic shock to that entire foundation. He talked about Sarah, how he had loved her, but how it had always felt like he was playing a part, performing the role of the perfect boyfriend. He admitted that with me, for the first time, he didn't have to perform. He could just be. The comfort he found with me wasn't just about his grief. It was about a deeper sense of homecoming he was only just beginning to understand. It was a painful, messy process. There were tears and long, difficult silences. But for every moment of fear, there was a moment of connection. I held his hand through it all, a physical anchor in his emotional storm. I told him about my own years of silence, about the love I had hidden away, about the quiet ache of watching him with Sarah, about the sweet agony of our nights on the couch. I laid my own vulnerability bare, showing him that he was not alone in his fear or his uncertainty. We were navigating this new, uncharted territory together. We didn't sleep that night. We talked until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the windows, painting the room in soft, new colors. When the words finally ran out, we were left in a state of quiet, exhausted peace. We were still on the floor, me kneeling in front of him, our hands still entwined. He looked at me, his eyes clear and tired, but the frantic fear was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. Can we just stay here for a little while?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. I nodded, and he shifted in the armchair, making space. I moved from the floor to sit beside him, our bodies pressed together from shoulder to knee. It was a mirror of our ritual on the couch, but this time, everything was different. There was no ambiguity, no plausible deniability. This was intentional. This was a choice, made in the clear light of day, with all our truths laid bare between us. He leaned his head on my shoulder, a familiar weight that now felt completely new. It was not the desperate act of a man seeking unconscious comfort. It was the trusting gesture of a man who had finally come home. I wrapped my arm around his shoulders, holding him close, and he sighed, a deep, contented sound that seemed to come from the very core of his being. We both closed our eyes, And in the quiet of the morning, surrounded by the ghosts of our old friendship and the promise of something new, we finally slept. The days that followed were gentle. We moved around each other with a new kind of awareness, a soft-edged tenderness. The loud, crushing silence was gone, replaced by the comfortable, foundational quiet we had once shared. But it was different now, richer, imbued with a new depth of understanding. We were learning a new language, one spoken in small gestures. A lingering touch as we passed in the hallway, a shared smile over our morning coffee, the way his eyes would find mine across the room and hold my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. The couch became our space. The ritual continued, but it was transformed. It was no longer a desperate act of seeking solace from grief, but a conscious act of seeking each other. He would come home, and he would find me, and we would settle together, our limbs tangled, his head on my shoulder or my chest, my hand stroking his hair. Sometimes we would talk, sometimes we would watch a movie, but often we would just exist in that quiet space, drawing strength and peace from each other's presence. The fear hadn't vanished completely. I would still see flashes of it in his eyes sometimes, a flicker of uncertainty, but it no longer held him captive. He was choosing to be brave, every day, every moment we were together. And his bravery made me brave, too. The first kiss after our talk happened a week later. We were on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the city lights twinkling outside the window. He had been quiet for a long time, and I had been watching the play of emotions on his face. He turned to me, his expression serious and open. He didn't ask for permission this time. He just leaned in and kissed me, slowly, deeply. It was a kiss of profound certainty, a kiss that tasted of gratitude and promise. It was a kiss that said, "This is real. We are real." When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against mine, our breath mingling in the small space between us. "I'm still scared," he whispered. "I know," I whispered back. "But are you going to run?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he shook his head, a small, definitive movement against my skin. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I'm done running. I'm home," and that was it. That was the moment the new foundation settled, solid and sure beneath our feet. We began to build a life in the quiet, beautiful, honest space we had created together. The bedroom doors, once symbols of our separation and avoidance, started staying open again. Some nights, he would come into my room, or I would go into his, not out of a desperate need to escape loneliness, but out of a simple, joyful desire to be together. We would fall asleep wrapped around each other, and there was no longer any need to pretend it was an accident. It was a choice. It was our new normal. I remember one morning, a few months later. I woke up to the smell of coffee and the soft morning light filtering through my bedroom window. Liam was already up, a silhouette moving in the kitchen. I lay there for a moment, watching him, and a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming washed over me. The constant, low-grade hum of my secret love, the ache of longing that had been my companion for so long, was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, steady warmth, a feeling of rightness that resonated in my very bones. He turned, saw that I was awake, and his face broke into a slow, easy smile. It was a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, a smile of pure, unadulterated happiness. It was the smile I had fallen in love with years ago, but now, it was for me. It was ours. We never did put a label on it, not in those early days. We didn't need to. We were Julian and Liam. We were two friends who had gotten lost in the wilderness of grief and confusion and had found our way to a new, unexpected clearing. We were two people who had learned that sometimes the quietest rooms hold the loudest truths, and that the bravest thing you can ever do is ask someone to sit with you in the dark. We were building our world not with grand declarations, but with small, sacred rituals, with shared mugs of coffee, with heads resting on shoulders, with hands that found each other in the quiet of the night. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a simple question on a Tuesday night, a shared silence in a dimly lit room. You don't realize their significance at the time, but when you look back, you see that they were the turning points, the moments when the entire landscape of your future shifted on its axis. Liam's quiet request to not be alone was one of those moments. He thought he was just running from the silence of his own grief, but what he was really doing was running towards a truth he hadn't yet discovered. He was running towards me, and I, who had spent years standing perfectly still, had been waiting for him all along. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a quiet that was no longer empty, but full of the unspoken, and now spoken, promise of home.